on today's program, I'm going to explain Revelation chapter 14. Revelation chapter 14 is all about the rapture, the tribulation, and the battle of Armageddon. Now, you wouldn't really know that if you just read the text, and that is why you have to go to seminary and get told that. Because if you just read it, you just read about musical man virgins and wine drinking, and how God really don't like that wine drinking. Now, I don't know what God has against wine drinking, since he told Jesus to drink it, but here God don't like it because it's Babylon wine, and apparently that's what makes Armageddon. And Jesus in the clouds, of course, which is probably why they're drinking wine during the Great Tribulation. Anyway, the chapter ends with Armageddon, which happens in a vineyard. And there was this news report just the other day how wine drinking has increased, showing that we are surely in the last days. So, anyway, that's the prophecy in the news today.
In the previous video, you saw that the Counter-Reformation has used misdirection and obfuscation to completely cloak the entire main point of John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 14, which focuses on wine. It's serving, drinking and production. Not an imaginary rapture, not a fictitious tribulation, and not a later prophesied Armageddon that is not even mentioned until another whole chapter later. And what Revelation 14 does spend 12 of 20 verses on, Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology, cannot even bring itself to barely mention. Despite the fact, its frequency creates a 158% saturation in the latter half of the chapter. In this video, we are going to begin our exegesis of the 3 sections of chapter 14, beginning with the first section, in verses 1 through 5. In section 1, which continues from verse 1 to verse 5, it is obvious John is writing a series of contrast statements. The purpose of this section is to stand in contrast to what he wrote in chapter 13, describing the first and second beast, the mark of the beast, and the name of the beast. In chapter 14, in verses 1 through 5, John lists 5 contrasts to these things. One of the great failures of Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology is that it really can never tell you the reason why a text was written. When a text is placed into its historical context, one of the things that becomes immediately obvious to the reader is why the text was written to begin with. It fits into its circumstances like a hand fits into a glove. But when you take texts completely out of their historical contexts, the purpose for the text having been written to begin with disappears. And what you are left with is a series of inexplicably random texts that seem to have been randomly written for no apparent purpose. Pulling them out of their historical context takes away the logic of the author in writing the text to begin with. And what you have left is a series of unrelated interpreted meanings that are serving as nothing more than ink blots for anyone's free association thousands of years away, in another entire part of the world, having nothing to do with the author of the sentences or any of his intended meanings. John's 5 contrasts stand in distinction to the absolute monarchy created by the Roman Empire in chapter 13. None of these contrast statements have anything to do with the rapture, the tribulation or Armageddon. But they do have everything to do with the Roman monarchy established in chapter 13, John refers to as the first and second beast. All 5 points are intended to serve as a contrast between what was true and what is false. When you look at a contrast statement, you are seeing one statement, but its purpose is to stand in contrast to what is implied. So in essence, you are seeing 2 statements being made at the same time, For example, if you have two twins, one twin is named Bobby and the other is named Billy. If you are the mother, and say to Billy, "You know Billy, Bobby doesn't tell lies." What is the contrast intended to communicate? The contrast is intended to point out to Billy that he does tell lies. And that stands in contrast to his brother Bobby. So in making one statement, a contrast statement makes two statements, which are opposites, at the same time. We will go through each of John's 5 contrast statements now, beginning in verse 1. Quote, "And I looked and behold, a lambkin standing on Mount Zion and with him 144,000, having the name of his father written upon their foreheads." End quote. We see in verse 1, the following topics. 1. The lambkin. 2. Mount Zion. 3. The 144,000 martyrs. 4. The name of the Father. First, the lambkin. If you remember in chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, the lambkin was symbolic of Christ, but was not literally Christ. It was an astronomical reference to Aries. We have the very same thing taking place here because John is giving a prophecy, and his reference to Aries is giving astronomical dating for his prophecy. Secondly, John mentions Mount Zion and that he sees the 144,000 martyrs on Mount Zion, with the lambkin. Is this a triumphant scene at the end of time where 144,000 all go on a parade? What is this about? First, it is not something about the future. It is a scene from the past. How do you know that? Because if you go back to chapter 7 where John describes it in detail, he uses the past and present tense to describe their martyrdoms. Secondly, this martyrdom is happening in John's own day, which he describes in the opening of his book in chapter 1 verse 9. In chapter 7, John is describing the genocide of the Jews which was taking place in his own day, when he was writing the text in the book of Revelation. You can't project that onto the faraway future, because John doesn't let you. He uses the present tense in his own day. Thirdly, John describes them on Mount Zion, because that is where symbolically, they were martyred, in the destruction of Jerusalem. So where did John get the idea for the figure of 144,000 Jews who were sealed out of the 12 tribes of Israel? There were 3 sources for John's doctrine of 144,000 martyrs, in the destruction of Judea, in 70 AD. The first source was the doctrine of the remnant in the Old Testament. The Old Testament prophets had taught that even in times of apostasy, God had always maintained a faithful remnant in Israel. A remnant could be as small a number as 8 souls saved during the time of Noah, or it could be a substantial number, such as the 7,000 prophets, who had not bowed their knee to Baal during the time of Elijah. The second source of inspiration was the tithe portion. The tithe was 10% and represented the portion that God had reserved unto himself. A tithe was a financial contribution, but it represented that God had reserved 1/10 for himself. The third source was the actual number of Jews who were being killed. Josephus estimated 1 million Jews were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Modern estimates place the number at 1.4 million. 1/10 of 1.4 million is 140,000. And the fourth source of inspiration for the 144,000 martyrs is literally 12,000, which represented the 12 tribes of Israel, times 1,000. 1,000 was used in Greek symbolism as a symbolic number for fullness or completion. This was the source of the number 144,000 sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel. The fact that John uses the terminology of sealed, meaning it is closed up. As when you seal a letter. It is not something in the faraway future. It is something that has come to an end. The matter is sealed. There are no more descendants from the 12 tribes of Israel today. So it would be an impossibility for any future Jews to be sealed up from the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes no longer exist. So this is both historically and grammatically, from the language in the text itself, this is a past event. And the only way to get it future is simply ignore John's own language about it. And if you are going to do that, why bother reading what he has written anyway? That is also why, by the way, they are shown to be all males. Male combatants were killed. However, women and children were taken into slavery. The virgin females were turned into sex slaves for the Romans. That is why John mentions the 144,000 are all male, and they do not defile virgins, whereas the Romans do. We are going to look at that text in more detail in a few minutes, and understand why John brought that subject up. The amazing thing about the 144,000 martyrs, however, is how modern Counter-Reformation rapture preachers do not even want to acknowledge their sacrifice in history. They would prefer modern audiences never even knew they existed. They would prefer to simply hit the delete button on the entire sacrifice of their lives. And that is unfortunately an amazingly cruel act of Antichrist anti-Semitism concerning history. The last and possibly most important point which must be mentioned concerning the 144,000 martyrs from chapter 7 is, if you remember, John uses this symbolic number to give a time conversion date for the year 476 AD. And as you recall, the year 476 AD was the very year historians cite as the year that the Roman Empire fell. So the real purpose of the number was really to serve as a prophetic value in John's prophecy against the Roman Empire. While historically, it might have been a close approximation of the actual number of Jewish Christians killed in the Roman genocide after 70 AD, its real value served as a time conversion value that accurately predicted the fall of the Roman Empire, and thus it's used by John. John begins this chapter reminding his readers the Romans were responsible for the martyrdoms of hundreds of thousands of the earliest followers of Christ. They were being exterminated by the hundreds of thousands. And it is with this opening that John sets the stage to prophesy the divine judgments that will constitute chapter 14. The last item on the list in verse 1 was that John states, in contrast to the people of the first and second beast of Rome, the people who follow the real Christ, who are slain on Mount Zion, have the name of his Father on their forehead. That was a very significant prophetic theological statement. Because if you remember in chapter 13, John prophesies the rise of John Chrysostom, and a very substantial theological strain of anti-Semitism. In fact, the influence was so severe, the Hebrew language became forbidden to know. It was actually prohibited by the Roman Empire for Christians to know. Well, obviously, if Hebrew is a forbidden language, it would be fairly impossible to see these people as having the Hebrew name of God plastered on their foreheads. And that was the whole point of the imagery. There was an obvious contradiction there, John was pointing out to his readers prophetically. The people of Revelation chapter 13 are obviously not the people of Christ. And that is what he was bringing to his readers' attention. Verse 2 reads as follows, quote, "And I heard a sound out of the sky, like the sound of great waters, and like the sound of great thunder, and I heard the sound of lyre musicians, playing their lyres." End quote. In verse 2, John states he hears the sound of rushing waters and the sound of thunder, and the sound of lyre musicians. As noted previously, the lyre was the instrument of choice, played in the temple in Jerusalem. So why does John bring up temple musicians? And why does he bring up the sound of a flood? And what do musicians have to do with a flood? Once again, this is a contrast statement. John mentions in Revelation chapter 18, verse 22, that Rome has harpers, musicians, pipers, and trumpeters. These musicians of Babylon in chapter 18 are mentioned in contrast to Jerusalem's temple musicians here in chapter 14. There is a contrast between them. Not only in the kind of instruments that they are playing, but the nature of the music. John sees in his vision the music moving the flood waters. This was a prophetic vision of a flood, being moved by the music of the 144,000 martyrs. Water is a very important element to Rome. The title of the chief religious authority of the whole empire, held by Caesar, was the Latin title of Pontifex Maximus. This title literally means chief bridge builder. But in Roman culture, it was the title of the supreme religious leader of the empire. And this title was transferred from Caesar to the head of the absolute monarchy created by Rome, by Constantine, and that John had prophesied in chapter 13. The city of Rome was founded on the Tiber River, and one of the most important tasks for the city government of Rome was construction and maintenance of its bridges over the Tiber River, which linked the two halves of the city. The city of Rome was actually founded on a floodplain. But Rome had situated its most important real estate on a series of 7 hills throughout the city. Consequently, when the Tiber did flood, the floods inundated the lower-lying surrounding areas where lesser desirable real estate existed. So while the floods of the Tiber would take significant tolls on human life, it was never the lives of Rome's most important citizens, and therefore even though the death tolls, caused by the floods of the Tiber, could climb into the tens of thousands, the flood events would rarely ever earn more than a single passing comment by Roman historians. But one thing the Tiber floods would do, that would get the attention of the Romans, and that was, destroy its sacred bridges. And this catastrophe would directly reflect on the very title of Rome's Pontifex Maximus. In fact, such events would often be seen as omens concerning the Pontifex Maximus himself. And that is why John writes this prophecy. And we will learn more about this prophecy in the historic fulfillment of chapter 14. But as you can see, there is nothing about the rapture or the tribulation or Armageddon in this verse. It does, however, have to do with some very real history concerning the city of Rome. Verse 3 reads as follows, quote, "And they sang a new song, in the presence of the throne, and the 4 living creatures and the elders, and no one was able to understand the song, if it were not for the 144,000 purchased out of the land." End quote. In verse 3, we see another example of a text, as interpreted by Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology, that makes no sense and has no purpose. And that John just wrote for no apparent reason. The text says the martyrs are singing in heaven, but no one can understand what they are singing. And in the frame of Counter-Reformation eschatology, there is no explanation for why that would even be relevant, or why John would have been motivated to write it. But if you put the text back into its historical context, all of a sudden, the text becomes not only meaningful, but prophetic, concerning real history. John is prophesying a language barrier. The language of the 144,000 martyrs from the 12 tribes of Israel, who are singing in God's presence, in heaven. What they are singing cannot be understood. There is a language barrier. Why would that be prophetic? Because under the papacy, and the influence of John Chrysostom, learning Hebrew was actually made illegal. And that is the point of John's prophecy in verse 3. The people of the empire who are claiming to represent Christ, can't even understand the words of the song, the 144,000 martyrs are singing in heaven. And the text makes perfect sense, including why John would have written it as a prophecy. Verse 4 reads as follows, quote, "These are they, with women do not defile virgins, for they are those who accompany the lambkin wheresoever he leads, purchased out of the first humans sacrificed to God and the lambkin." End quote. In verse 4, John brings up the subject of virgins and women. We are translating this text slightly different than the standard translation because of the meaning of the Greek term parthenos, which means unmarried daughter. But whether you take the translation this way, or the standard way, the point of the text still remains the same, so John's intended meaning is not lost either way. He is bringing up the subject of chastity. Counter-Reformationists will tell you to just ignore the details of this text, and they will assure you, its language is nothing more than more of John's empty rambling random symbolism, which you are completely free to use, as arbitrary ink blots, for whatever free association you might incidentally have with it, thousands of years later. And why would John in the middle of a text about the rapture and the tribulation and Armageddon bring up the subject of chastity? The answer is, obviously he wouldn't. Those subjects have nothing to do with one another. When you think of the tribulation and Armageddon, they obviously have nothing to do with musical virgins. And yet, within the first 4 verses of this chapter, 3 of them talk about flood waters, music and virgins. Topics which are as unrelated to Armageddon as potato chips are to Siberia. They obviously have nothing to do with each other. But the simple fact has to be completely ignored in the Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology explanation of this chapter. In fact, there is not even any apparent reason for John having written those texts. They stand as completely unrelated, random trivia to the alleged topic of the chapter, with no obvious purpose or point in even having been written by John, other than generic condemnations of generic things in a generic future, thousands of years from John's time. But, when you put the text back into its historical context, all of a sudden the text makes perfect sense, as well as the reason for it having been written. John is pointing out the contrast between the true original followers of Christ exemplified in the 144,000 original martyrs, killed on Mount Zion by Rome, and the people who are following the absolute monarchy of the Roman Empire. He is contrasting them on every point of their identity. In verse 4, he points out that the 144,000 martyrs, who are male casualties of Rome's destruction of Jerusalem, they did not defile virgins. Why was that such an incredibly amazing prophetic detail to state in his text? Because as you saw in chapter 13, John made a major point to prophesy, down to the very name, of the coming of Pope Sixtus III, as a sign of the absolute Roman monarchy he was prophesying in history. One of the most amazing details of Pope Sixtus III's rule, as the Roman Pontifex Maximus, was that he was famously put on trial for the act of seducing a nun into fornication with him. And now all of a sudden, this text has not only incredible purpose, but amazing historical meaning, down to such detail, it simply cannot be mistaken for anything else. But Counter-Reformationists prefer no one ever even hears about it. Instead, they would prefer you think these are all a bunch of random poetic texts that John wrote for no apparent reason, and with no apparent purpose. And this text not only brings the subject of chastity up concerning Pope Sixtus III, who John mentions prophetically by name in chapter 13, it even brings up another embarrassing detail of how Pope Sixtus III managed to survive his trial. In his defense, he cited the story in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 20. The section of texts in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 20 describes Christ teaching at the temple, after having come down from the Mount of Olives. In the narrative, while Christ is teaching, the scribes and Pharisees bring a woman to him who had been caught in adultery. They remind him that the law of Moses prescribes stoning for this offense, and the scribes and Pharisees ask him what they should do. And in the narrative, Christ makes the very famous statement, that he that is without sin, should cast the first stone. And after everyone is convicted, they all leave. And then Christ tells her to go and sin no more. When Pope Sixtus III was put on trial for seducing a nun, that was cited by him as his defense. It was allegedly so effective that the charge was dropped. Meaning also, however, that apparently what Pope Sixtus III had done was so common among the clergy at Rome that no one could prosecute Pope Sixtus III's offense without engaging in open public hypocrisy themselves. And the only other problem is that the very narrative he cited was not in the original Greek manuscripts. It was added by Jerome into the Latin Vulgate. It wasn't even John's writing. It was a completely fictitious addition to the New Testament that was very popular among the Latin fathers, because it supposedly showed Christ refuting the law of Moses, and that is why it was added. The problem was, of course, was that it was completely fictitious make-believe. John never wrote such a text, and Christ never taught such a thing. It was completely made up. So you can see why John, in the book of Revelation, would write this text. Not only addressing a major event in the pontificate of Pope Sixtus III, whom he prophesies by name, but even bringing up his use of a fictitious text that would in the future be ascribed to his very own writing. And obviously yes, this would be important to John. But according to Counter-Reformationists, John wasn't concerned about any of this. He was obsessing about a purely secular politician, thousands of years in the future, somewhere at the end of time. And none of this needs to be known by anyone, despite what John's clear intent in writing it really was. But, once again, You can see this clearly has nothing to do with an imaginary tribulation or Armageddon, and everything to do with some very real history. Verse 5 reads as follows, quote, "And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are faultless in the presence of the throne of God." End quote. The last verse in section 1 ends with the statement that the 144,000 martyrs who were killed on Mount Zion by Rome were without deceit and faultless in the presence of God. And why would John make this statement? Once again, going back to the fact these are contrast statements, he is contrasting the original followers of Christ who were murdered by Rome, in the destruction of Jerusalem and its aftermath of purges, against the followers of the beast, who John identifies prophetically as open advocates of deceit. And as you saw in the historical fulfillment of chapter 13, John's prophecies were completely accurate. That is precisely what they advocated. In contrast, John says in the mouth of the martyrs, there was no deceit. And he also says that in the presence of God, they are blameless, or faultless. Why does John write that? Because John is countering two lies he knows are coming, prophetically, before they even get started. The first lie will be that the original Jewish followers of Christ were not the true followers of Christ. John is countering that lie by pointing to the fact that they are with Christ, and that they are without deceit. And the second lie he knows is coming, is that they somehow deserve Rome's extermination. And he counters that lie by pointing to the fact they are faultless, and in the presence of the throne of God. Whenever any powerful nation, state or empire, intentionally victimizes a people, its excuse is always without fail that they somehow deserved what they got. And John knew that the narrative that would be spread by the empire concerning the genocide of Christ's original Jewish followers would be that they deserved what they got. And John says, no, they would be without fault and blameless in the presence of God. The Roman claim that they somehow got what they deserved would be a lie from hell, spread by the empire and by the same spirit of the Antichrist that killed them. And that brings us to the end of section 1, which is comprised of verses 1 through 5 of chapter 14. We have completed section 1 of chapter 14. As you see from an examination of the textual reconstruction of verses 1 through 5, there is clearly nothing about the rapture, a tribulation, or Armageddon in these texts. And in fact, the subject matters are clearly unrelated at every point. A clear simple reading of these texts, put back into their historical context, make them very clear and unmistakable prophetic references to the events surrounding the rise of Pope Sixtus III and the Roman papacy. A very simple truth. But such an unbearable truth to the ears of the Counter-Reformation that in their opinion deserves to be forever hidden from the world at all costs. But this fact points out the very truth John was accurately and truthfully prophesying, that what the world would come to one day think of as Christianity was in fact a genocidal lie perpetrated by an evil empire that John identified prophetically as the religion of the Antichrist. The hard truth that modern American evangelical Christians must come to realize, and that their ancestors had known and taught for centuries, which is absolutely true in the scriptures, is that Christianity without Reformation is the religion of the Antichrist. It has the Antichrist as its source, historically. That is what it is. And as you have also seen, it was this very Pope Sixtus III who bore the very prophesied name of 3 sixes, John cites in Revelation chapter 13 verse 18, that officiated and instituted the very first Christmas Mass at the Vatican, and authorized the inclusion of idolatry as the worship of Rome's Christ Mass. A worship, John prophesies, is the worship of the image of the beast. And what John will say in the next section of Revelation chapter 14, will leave absolutely no doubt as to its eternal consequence. an eternal consequence, every Christian on earth should be fully and completely warned about before embracing. But how many ministers today will dare tell the truth about what they are doing? And as you will soon see, a major question will have to be realistically asked: is it fair to consider these kinds of ministers that fill our land today, even Christians, at all? Unfortunately, John's answer to that question will be emphatically, no. They are not. Now that we have finished section 1, from verse 1 through verse 5, we will now examine section 2 of chapter 14, which begins in verse 6, and continues through verse 13. Next. Section 2 begins in verse 6, and continues to verse 13. The text in section 2 describes 3 messengers, which bring 3 messages. The 3 messages proclaim a warning concerning the deception John is prophesying Rome will foist onto the world stage. But according to Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology, these 3 messengers are, without a doubt, 3 bird-winged, pagan Greek Nikes, who will at the end of the world, after the rapture, and once the totally secular Antichrist has finally, after thousands of years, finally come, fly through the sky, and then, and only then, when the 3 Nikes preach these messages in the middle of the sky, in whatever the language is, of the people below them, only then, will these messages have any relevance to anyone on earth. Until then, they are completely irrelevant and may be all safely ignored. Counter-Reformationists call these things angels, grifting the Greek term angelos, but they always show a picture of a winged bird man, that is basically a pagan Greek Nike. Nikes were the attendant messenger spirits of the Greek mother goddess Athena, which descended historically from Ishtar, also known as the whore of Babylon, or more properly, the harlot of Inanna. And it is no accident either, by the way, that is their chosen definition of their word, angel. Because that is what their angels actually really are. Biblical angels looked like people. That is why you are told to be kind to strangers, because you could be entertaining angels. You basically couldn't tell them apart. Hebrews had no mythical creature they associated with the word angel. The word angel simply means messenger in the scriptures, and anything could serve as a messenger. A person, a star, an animal. There were no bird-winged people called angels. Those were Greek Nikes. And like all the other fictitious explanations the Counter-Reformation comes up with, pinning a Counter-Reformationist down on the exact logistics of his fantasies is once again a little difficult. For example, how big would this Nike have to actually be visible from the ground, from miles and miles around? It would have to be larger than the Statue of Liberty, obviously, since the Statue of Liberty can only be seen for 60 miles. To cover the entire Earth, it would take quite a bit more than 60 miles of visibility. The circumference of the Earth is about 24,000 miles. If you divided that into hemispheres, that would be about 12,000 miles. 60 miles goes into 12,000 miles 200 times. So that means you would need to fly in a 200 square mile grid, if you were a Nike the size of the Statue of Liberty, or you would need to be 200 times bigger than the Statue of Liberty. Times 2. Obviously, if they are not gargantuan in size, they would not even be noticed. But to be big enough to be seen everywhere, they would be indistinguishable from the sky itself. Will they show up on radar? If they show up on radar, they will obviously be shot at by air defense systems. But there is no statement by John that anything or anyone ever shoots at them. Will the Nikes all appear during the day when people are awake and can actually see them? Or will they appear at night? If they appear at night, will they be glowing? They will definitely have to be glowing to be seen at night. If they are glowing at night, how will anybody be able to distinguish them from stars or planets or satellites or planes? Unless they are gargantuan in size? If they are big enough to fill the sky, how will they be distinguished from the sky? Another problem would be acoustics. The higher up an object is in the sky, the more sound waves will dissipate, meaning the sound produced will have to be louder than even the sound of a jet engine, which when flying at a high altitude, viewed from ground, can appear to be almost silent despite its deafening loud noise volume. Jet engines are so incredibly loud, ground workers have to wear soundproofing ear protection to keep from losing their hearing. They are literally deafening, they are so loud. Yet at high altitudes, these same jet engines can be observed to be virtually silent from the ground. The high altitude required for everyone to be able to see would preclude a loud enough volume that everyone would also be able to hear. The two principles in physics cancel each other out. Unless, of course, the sound is so incredibly loud that it becomes a sonic force, meaning it is not simply heard, but actually breaks objects. Like sonic booms do windows, in which case, people would not be just hearing a nice little sermonette from the book of Revelation, their car windows would be exploding. But Counter-Reformationists do not like to be bothered by the little details of reality when it comes to propagating their fantasies, because after all, it's all medieval magic. After all, if you are going to believe in magical demon bugs, fire-breathing prophets, bottomless pits, and tribulation zombies, why start asking questions about the reality of the physics of giant necks and aeronautical acoustics? But yeah, that's a real thing. And it basically proves this scenario would not happen, as described in their fantasy. Because it is physically impossible. You could salvage the fantasy from physics by claiming it will be a giant global synchronized hallucination, and everyone on Earth will simultaneously hallucinate the scene. But that would simply be a cowardly cop-out, because it's not in the text. The text is quite clear. There are 3 messengers, and there is no question from the text, they are physically located in the sky. But John is not describing 3 giant pagan Greek knights. They are messengers. They are in the sky. And everyone does see them. But they are not pagan Greek Nikes. So what are they? To understand what John is describing in section 2 of chapter 14, you have to actually read what John wrote. John instructed his readers at the beginning of his book, in chapter 1 verse 20, quote, "The mystery of the 7 stars which thou saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 ecclesia, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 ecclesia." End quote. John says, point blank, the stars are the messengers. That is the word translated in the KJV as angel. That is what John was calling an angel in the book of Revelation. Not pagan Greek Nikes. And what John is about to describe in section 2 is the astronomical dating for the prophecy that follows in section 3. But before we look at section 3, we are going to look at the actual messages that these 3 messengers are going to bring. And we will begin looking at that now, beginning with verse 6, next. The first messenger is described in verses 6 and 7, which reads as follows, quote, "And I saw another messenger, flying in mid-sky, having good news for the end of time, declaring to the residents of the land, and every kind of ethnicity, and tribe, and language, and people, saying in a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory. Because the hour of his verdict came. So worship the maker of the sky, and land, and sea, and fount of water." End quote. This first messenger is interpreted to be the giant Nike that flies across the world preaching the gospel, because the word that is translated gospel is used in the text. But John gives the content of the message, and it is not the gospel. The gospel per se is that Christ was crucified for sin, was buried and rose again. John states that the first messenger brings a message that has to do with the focus of worship. That God alone is worthy of that worship. This is the same message that Christ reiterated in Matthew chapter 4 verse 1, when Christ was tempted by Satan in the desert, to bow down and worship him, in order to gain the kingdoms of the earth. John begins the first message with this point, because obviously that is the spiritual principle that is being violated. John is implying some powerful people obviously did bow down to Satan, to gain the kingdoms of the earth. There are things that are being bowed down to and worship that are not God. And that is the point of the first messenger and the first message. And it also brings the warning that a verdict has been reached because of this. That is a legal term being used and means the judgment of a judge has been rendered. Secondly, as you will notice in all three cases, John actually writes down their messages. Which obviously, if these were three literal giant preaching Nikes, John was really prophesying, there would really be no reason to try to write down what they would be preaching. John is writing down the messages that the three messengers will bring, because if he didn't, you wouldn't know what they were. As he explained in chapter 1 verse 20. The secret or mystery of this book, in John's own words, is that the stars are the messengers. Or in other words, John is using astronomical dating for his prophecies. Thirdly, the text says that this messenger has good news for eons of time. If this were a giant Nike making a one-over across the world, preaching the gospel, it would be a one-time event and done. It would not have good news for eons of time. But apparently, the messenger John is talking about will be there for ages. That simply rules out the idea this is a one-time flyover by a giant Nike. The second messenger is described in verse 8, next. The second messenger is described in verse 8, and reads as follows, quote, "And another messenger came, in the same way, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the great city, for out of the wine, of the passion of her prostitution, she gave drink to all ethnicities." End quote. The second message is that Babylon the great is fallen. And the wine she is serving to the nations, is her passion for prostitution. Which is obviously, a very ugly message. Counter-Reformationists want to absolutely assure everyone that whatever this means, it certainly and absolutely has no reference whatsoever to papal Rome. In fact, it could mean anything on earth. And you will be amazed at how absolutely creative and imaginative they will get to apply this to anything and everything on earth but papal Rome. But they are absolutely certain, whatever it means, it has no reference in any way, shape or form to papal Rome. They will tell you, it refers to Jerusalem and the nasty Christ-hating Jews. Or Mecca and the violent Muslims. Or America and its filthy greed. In fact, they will come up with every excuse on planet Earth you can imagine to claim this text absolutely has no reference whatsoever to papal Rome. They will even suggest it refers to aliens from outer space, that it is literally how desperate they are to find any alternative whatsoever, other than the only thing it can refer to. And it is very clear that is precisely the one and the only thing this text can realistically refer to. Why? Because as you saw in chapter 13, John specifies by very name who and what he is talking about. And you really can't miss it, unless that is precisely what you have decided to do. Which is precisely what Counter-Reformationists did. Babylon is identified in chapter 17 as the city of 7 mounts, that rules over the kings of the earth. Rome was called the Septimonium, which was its original name. And it literally means the 7 mounts. And the text is in the present tense. The city which is currently ruling the kings of the earth. That is not a description about a city 2,000 years later. It is a very clear reference to Rome, the city that was ruling the kings of the earth in John's day, when the text was being written. And there is absolutely no real confusion or ambiguity over that reference. But John is not prophesying against a secular or pagan Rome. He is prophesying about a Rome that will create the absolute monarchy he describes as the first and second beast of chapter 13. And who will be headed up by a name whose name will literally be 3 sixes. John is getting as specific and literal as any human could have ever been. And furthermore, he places at the very center of his description an absolutely unmistakable identifier that has nothing to do with Jews, or Muslims, or atheists, or secularists, or communists, or New Agers, or the Illuminati, or Bilderbergers, or the Council on Foreign Relations, or aliens from outer space. He puts the word wine. And if you know anything at all about papal Rome, you would know why that one word needs absolutely no explanation. But just in case you don't, we will explain it for you. At the very center of Roman theology, its very core, is the claim that its wine, when magically blessed by its priests, is transformed into the literal blood of Christ. Not in a symbolical way, but that it literally becomes the very blood of Christ. It is a doctrine known as transubstantiation. This is the basis of what is called the Roman Mass. They also claim that Christ is literally and physically present in the Roman Mass. So when you drink this wine, which is his literal blood, you are saved, because you have his blood. But if you do not drink this magically transformed wine, then you are not saved, because you do not have his blood. All of Rome's theology centers around the claim that its wine is what saves people, which is the ritual it calls its Mass, as in Christ Mass on December 25th. This ritual, according to their own claim, is traced back to Ignatius of Antioch. You have already seen how the group of people John begins his book describing are the Nicolaitans from Antioch. And these are the same people John ties to the Antichrist, which is the very thing he is prophesying now in this very chapter. This ritual, called the Mass, was invented by Ignatius of Antioch to replace the Passover meal commanded by Christ and his apostles, because the Passover meal was too Jewish. So Ignatius decided he would just replace it with this new ritual called a Mass. This cavalier and completely arbitrary replacement of the actual real Lord's Supper in the Passover meal became the very centerpiece of Rome's theology. And John puts it right in the middle of the second message. And that one word, unmistakably singles papal Rome out from every other possible religion, culture, entity or city on planet Earth. The wine. The wine is prostitution. And that is a second message. The third messenger and message is described in verses 9, 10 and 11, and reads as follows, quote, "And a third messenger came in the same way, in a great voice saying, If anyone worships the beast or his icon, or receives his mark upon the forehead or upon his hand, even they will drink from the wine of the passion of God, poured out undiluted in the cup of his abhorrence, and they will be tortured in fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy messengers and in the presence of the Lambkin. And the smoke of their torment goes up into eons and eons of time. And they will not have rest day or night, who worship the beast and his icon, or if they receive his mark." End quote. And here we have John's final warning in the three messages, and it is the most severe. It is an unequivocal promise of eternal damnation. It is not measured, conditional or temporary. And in this warning, John describes the religious activities of the religion Rome will be inventing. He describes the drinking of the wine, the worship of the icons, and the taking of the ash mark, and he promises whoever does any of these things, indicating all or any of them, they will not be saved at all. In fact, they will be damned. And that is as severe a warning as can be written. And despite its severity and its source, there are religious leaders who call themselves Christians and actually think no one should ever hear about it. That it would be better to pretend it has only to do with the end of the world and has no relevance for life for billions of souls over the thousands of years in the meantime. But those are also the very same religious leaders John is promising eternal damnation in this warning. So it should not come as a surprise. The problem for modern pseudo-Christian Protestants who wish to celebrate Rome's Christ Mass because they enjoy the party so much and all the pagan activities, is that John's promise applies to them just as well. John's warning is all-inclusive. If you partake of any part of it, you are guilty of all of it. And you will bear the unconditional judgment of God for doing it. And that is the third and final message of the three messages. There are only 2 verses left in section 2, which are verse 12 and 13, which we will look at next. The last two verses in section 2 are found in verses 12 and 13, and read as follows, quote, "Here is the cheerful endurance of the sacred, here they keep the commandments of God and the faith of Joshua. And I heard a voice out of the sky saying to me, Right blessed are the dead in the Lord, who will be dying off henceforth. Yes, says the Spirit that will give rest from their labor, but their work will continue hereafter them." End quote. In the last two comments in section 2, John points out two more contrasts between the genuine followers of Christ and the followers of the Roman monarchy. He says they keep two things. One is the commandments of God, which is a reference to the Torah, and the second is the faith of Joshua, which is the English translation of the Greek, Jesus. The anglicized corruption Jesus was used to intentionally separate it from Joshua, which is the problem with it. It wasn't separated from Joshua, it was the same. And that sameness really should have remained reflected in the text. If they had wanted something separate, they would have done that themselves, but they did not. Because they wanted that overlap reflected in their language. Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land after the death of Moses. John makes a point that the real followers of Christ keep the commandments of God and the faith of Joshua. Why was that such a big deal? Because with those two qualifiers, he is pointing out that the 144,000 martyrs who followed Christ were Jewish, and their religion was the Jewish religion, as was Christ's. The coming new Roman religion, crafted by the Nicolaitans and enforced by the Roman Empire, will not be the religion of Christ or his followers. And the last statement he makes in section 2 is that despite the fact the martyrs will be dying off from this time forward, their work will outlive them. And that concludes section 2 of Revelation 14. In this section John gives the astronomical dating for the prophecy which will now follow in section 3. After we are done exegeting the text of this chapter, we will go back and build its historical timeline for its prophecies and then look at its historical fulfillment in more detail. Section 2 sets up the astronomical dating for the prophecy in section 3, which we are going to look at now. You've seen so far that section 1 is a series of contrast statements between the original Jewish martyrs of Christ killed on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and the followers of the Roman monarchy described in chapter 13, who serve and follow 666, worship his icon, and take his mark. And that section 1 mentions a prophecy about flood waters. You've seen section 2 gives astronomical dating and contains 3 warnings about the wine, or replacement cup, of the worship practice of the Roman monarchy. That it will not save anyone. In fact, it will do precisely the opposite. Because it was spiritually based on a genocidal lie. Literally, over the dead bodies of the martyrs of Christ who died on Mount Zion. And Rome's cup, or wine, is not the cup of Christ, but its substitution. And you have seen that in section 1, there is nothing really talking about an imaginary rapture, and in section 2, there is nothing about an imaginary tribulation. And the very thing, both section 1 and section 2 are addressing, Counter-Reformationists would prefer you not even see. And thus, their contorted explanations. Now, we come to section 3. And according to Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology, section 3, which runs from verse 14 to verse 20, is all about Armageddon, and the harvest of the earth. But, Counter-Reformation preachers who are propagating this explanation, know fully well, neither term, earth or world, is anywhere in the actual text in chapter 14, in the Greek. And they also know that wine is at the center of what John is condemning in section 2. And they know that wine, music and virgins have nothing to do with the tribulation or Armageddon, but it does have everything to do with Roman religion. And they know that it is the subject of the wine, and what has produced it, that is under God's judgment in the prophecy in verses 14 through 20, which we will look at now, beginning in verse 14, which reads as follows, quote, "And I saw and beheld white clouds, and upon the clouds, one sitting, like the Son of Man, having upon his head a golden stephanos and in his hand a sharp gathering hook." End quote. John describes what is clearly a completely astronomical scene in verse 14, which we will look at in more detail when we do the astronomical dating for the timeline for this prophecy in the next video. Verse 15 reads as follows, quote, "And another messenger came out of the temple screaming in a great voice to the one sitting upon the clouds, Thrust your gathering hook and harvest, for the hour of the harvest has come, and the crops of the land are ripe." End quote. The harvest John is talking about is the harvest of the vineyard that has produced the wine for Rome. That is the crops of the land. Not the earth, but the land where this wine is produced. Verse 16 reads as follows, quote, "And the one sitting upon the clouds thrust his gathering hook upon the land and harvested the land." End quote. John says he thrust the pruning hook into the land. Not the earth, but the land. What land is John talking about? It is the land that has produced the wine for Rome. Verse 17 and 18 reads as follows, quote, "Another messenger came out of the temple in the sky, he also having a sharp gathering hook. And another messenger came out from the sacrificial altar having privilege with the fire and cried out with a great voice to him having the sharp gathering hook, saying, Thrust the sharp gathering hook and collect the clusters of grapes of the vine from the land, for her grapes have ripened." End quote. You see, once again, John is talking about the production of the wine, not the whole earth, and what is being harvested as the grapes of that vine. And the land he is referring to is the land where this vineyard exists. Verse 19 reads as follows, quote, "And the messenger threw his gathering hook into the land and gathered the grapes of the land, into the vat of the passion of Elohim the great God." End quote. In verse 19, John mentions the land again. What land? The land that produced the wine. John mentions the grapes again, and says that they are thrown into the vat of God's wrath. And then we read verse 20, quote, "And the vat was trodden outside the city and blood came out of the vat, until the bridle of the horses, from 1,600 stades." End quote. He says this vat is trodden outside the city. What city has John mentioned? The city of Rome, which he called Babylon. But here John is not talking about that city. He says this is the vineyard, where the wine for Rome is produced, and here in the land, outside of the city, God will tread down this vineyard, and blood will be spilled for 1,600 stades. Which is about 180 miles. That's the prophecy. If you Google the size of the earth, you will discover it's a whole lot bigger than 180 miles. John is not prophesying anything about the whole earth. He is prophesying a location that is outside of Rome, that produced the wine for its cup, and whose destruction will span for 180 miles. It will include destruction by fire and bloodshed. That is all this prophecy states. The land that John is describing, where the wine is produced for Rome, is the land of Antioch. And there is one very simple, very easy way to verify this is the case. Because it is a prophecy that can be verified in the historical record. And that is precisely what we are going to do. In the next video, we will construct the astronomical dating for Revelation chapter 14, and then we will look into history, to see if John's prophecies came to pass, the way they are actually written, in the text. At the beginning of this video, we noted how none of the content of the texts in Revelation 14 match the subject matter of what they are allegedly talking about, according to Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology. Virgins, musicians, wine, water, vineyards, etc., have absolutely nothing to do with a battle scenario like Armageddon, or an imaginary tribulation with some political secular Antichrist ruling the world, forcing everyone to get retail sales tracking chips implanted into their foreheads, in the middle of two extinction-level events. Counter-Reformationists cannot explain why these texts were written by John. They have absolutely no explanation for the subject matter that is being discussed in them. But if you put these texts back into their historical contexts, then all of a sudden, these very strange unrelated topics become very related, apparent and obvious. And now, we will illustrate how that happens. Every text has an amazing direct relevance to what John is prophesying about the coming Roman religion, its religious practices, and its leader. Verse 1 begins with the 144,000 Jewish martyrs. John notes in chapter 7 they come from the 12 tribes of Israel, and in chapter 14 notes that they have the Hebrew name of God on their forehead. There is no question, John is identifying these martyrs as Jews. Why would he begin the chapter with this point? Because what was coming was going to be very anti-Semitic. As he clearly stated, in chapter 13 verse 6, that they would even go so far as to blaspheme the Hebrew sacred name of God. He begins with the martyrs because he knows they will create a false non-Jewish Roman narrative about martyrs. And the original Jewish martyrs will not even be acknowledged as either knowing Christ, or in God's presence. So he begins by stating precisely that, on both counts, they not only know Christ, but are in God's presence and are faultless. They are all males, because it was the males who were martyred. Women were taken as slaves, and the virgins were forced into sex slavery. In verse 2, he mentions the martyrs and music, because the replacement called the Christ Mass would be accompanied by and surrounded with all manner of music, and musicians, trumpets, stringed instruments, and pipers of all kinds. So John mentions the music of the martyrs, and how their music would stir the flood waters of heaven. And he mentions the flood waters, because this is what destroyed the bridges in Rome. And the title of the chief religious leader in Rome was the Pontifex Maximus. In verse 3, he prophesies that no one could understand what the martyrs were singing, because he knew the absolute monarchy of chapter 13 would bring a language barrier, and was pointing out that the people of 666 would not even be able to understand the words of the song the martyrs were singing. They would be clueless as to the genuine faith. In verse 4, he said the real martyrs did not defile virgins, because he knew Rome would create an order of virgins, which they called nuns, but these virgins served the sexual appetites of the Roman clergy, including that of the very Pope Sixtus III himself, that John had prophesied by name, in chapter 13, verse 18. In verse 5, John prophesied in the mouth of the Jewish martyrs, there was no guile, because he knew from Rome's earliest days as Nicolaitans, they had embraced the intentional practice of deceit, and would advocate it in the teaching of John Chrysostom, the mouth, which he had prophesied in chapter 13. And he stated the Jewish martyrs would be blameless in the presence of God, because Rome would spread the lie, they got what they deserved. In verse 6 and 7 he prophesied the first message would be to worship God only, because he knew the Nicolaitans of Antioch had bowed down to Satan to gain the kingdoms of the earth. In verse 8, he calls Rome Babylon, because Babylon was famous for two things to Jews. It was famous for its hostility toward biblical Judaism, and for its idolatry. And he knew that Rome's Christ Mass, along with its musicians, and virgins, and wine, would also be surrounded by the worship of idols. Thus the name Babylon. In verse 9, he mentions the worship of icons, and taking the ash mark, because he knew Rome would institute these practices. And in verse 10 and 11, he prophesies that if you drink from Rome's cup, you will not be saved. Because John knows, the lie that Rome will be telling the world, that it is the cup of Christ, will be a very ugly genocidal lie. And in fact, Rome's cup of idolatry, will instead, be the replacement of it. In verses 12 and 13, he prophesies the original believers will be soon dying off, because he knows Rome is intentionally exterminating them. But he says that despite the absence of their physical presence on earth, their work will outlive them. And one of the very reasons will be, because of the very book he is writing about them, to preserve their message. And in verses 14 through 20, the time of Babylon's wine vineyard will be brought to a violent and destructive end. It will be crushed like the grapes in a wine vat, and it will be burned into ashes. And John calls it a wine vat, because he knows what is coming is something called the Vatican, as in, a wine vat. And he says that blood will reach the horse's bridle, because Antioch was famous for its horses. It was the site of one of the most famous equestrian horse tracks in the entire world, and would become a focal point of events of the very prophecy he was now writing. And that is why John wrote these texts. And not a single word of any of it has anything to do with an imaginary rapture, a tribulation hoax, or an Armageddon that has not even been mentioned yet. But that is also why the Counter-Reformationist cannot tell you why a single word of chapter 14 was ever even written. In this video, you have seen that in the first section, John prophesies flood water in verse 2, a coming language barrier in verse 3, the defilement of virgins in verse 4, and the practice of intentional deceit in verse 5. And none of these things have anything to do with the rapture. In section 2, you saw that John prophesies the cup of Rome will bring damnation to those who drink from it, who worship Rome's icon, or who take its mark. And section 2 likewise has nothing to do with the tribulation, and the messengers that John describes in the sky are stars, not giant pagan Greek Nikes. In section 3, you saw that John prophesies a violent destruction of the source of Rome's wine, the land of Antioch, Syria. And this destruction will come from a violent crushing and fire. And likewise, section 3 has nothing to do with the harvest of the earth, or the battle of Armageddon. It is restricted to a regional area, less than 180 miles, in radius. Which is certainly way too small to be a harvest of the whole earth. And you have seen that the most central theme of the entire chapter, which is wine, is not even hardly mentioned by Counter-Reformationists who explain Revelation chapter 14. In fact, they intentionally smother the content of the chapter with completely irrelevant descriptions that come from their fictitious theology, rather than the words of the texts. In the next video, we will examine John's astronomical dating for his prophecies, and construct the historical timeline for the fulfillment of these events in real history. Thank you for watching.